All right, so just to kind of kick things off, this is an interactive webinar series that I've decided to start doing at least once a month, as often as I can possibly put it together. And it's all about, researching theories and trying to create best practices for world languages teachers. Today's topic is my top 10 tips for being an effective conversational teacher. So my name is David el Profe, David the professor. So the idea behind the series is I've been teaching English and Spanish for almost the past 20 years on and off in full time since 2012, I think. And I've gone about it very differently. I opened up a private language school for adults here in Denver. And I've been just teaching, right? I got my bachelor's degree in Spanish International Business and Marketing, and I decided to kind of take that combined business experience and knowledge of the Spanish language and become a teacherpreneur, right? Start my own business based off of teaching. And I've noticed, increasingly, I've been trying to interact more with other teachers. I'm kind of in a little bubble over here in my own world. And I've been publishing books, and I've been teaching students, I've been training teachers, I've been doing it all. And with the pandemic kind of shaking things up in this community, I feel like education was probably the most affected industry other than maybe travel and hospitality, right? And it kind of caused me to start thinking about things in a new way and trying to figure out how I can better serve my community and better serve my students. And I decided that I wanted to start trying to collaborate more with other teachers. I think that we can all learn a lot from each other and help each other a lot if we try to work together a little bit more. And I've noticed especially there's a really big disconnect between academia, that kind of creates the landscape for teaching languages, but then the teachers like us that are actually out here teaching it in doing the practice, right? So I just thought we could kind of try to work together to bridge the gap here, right? Between theory and practice. The highlights of today's webinar are going to be on developing best practices for teaching conversation. I really like talking about the importance of comprehensible input. And some really interesting things that I'm fascinated with are the psychological and the physiological responses of the body and the brain when it comes to speaking new languages. This says to leave your questions or comments that you have in the chat. So far, there's only 3 of us, so I'm fully open to the idea of making this a true interactive conversation. So feel free just to chime in with any questions or comments whenever you have. Now, as we go through this, some of the theories that I've really been reading up on lately would be Stephen Krashen's second language acquisition theory. Chris Lunsdale is another linguist out of China that gave a presentation quite some years ago about how anybody can learn how to speak a new language in 6 months, which I've just been fascinated with that concept of trying to speak a language faster, better, more efficiently. And then in more recent, years, I've been researching a lot about like speech and voice science by people like Alison Behrman, which we'll talk about with kind of the physiological stuff today, and then kind of the brain on language, the neuroscience by language by thought leaders like Harry Whitaker. And I'm going to mix in some other stuff from other people as we go too. Let's just go around the room and figure out who is actually here. So my name's David, and I am what's called a teacherpreneur. I'm a current teacher. Now I've created this webinar with kind of 3 people in mind. Somebody that's currently teaching a world language, somebody that's thinking about starting teaching a world language, and then somebody that wants to actually create a business as a teacherpreneur. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick, Lance?
Yeah, hi there. My name is Lance, and I am a recovering lawyer. I practiced law for, I truly feel that that's who I am. Practiced for 22 years here in Denver, and decided that that was enough of that. So closed my shop back in 2016. Became my mom's full-time caregiver shortly before she passed. And when she did, that kind of opened up a whole different world for me, turned my life upside down because I planned everything around her. I decided that teaching English is what I wanted to move on and do. So I got my TEFL training from the ITA, International TEFL Academy, and finished that training about 8 months ago, I guess it's been now. And lo and behold, El Profe came along and contacted me about the potential of, as he talks about, the teacherpreneur, potentially opening my own language school. And that is indeed what I'm doing. Working with David now for, I guess it's been a couple of weeks. We've been getting together, and his classes are fascinating. As I told David yesterday, Rich, I'm just amazed at his results. Sitting with those two students yesterday and listening to them speak and read the way they do, it was just amazing. There you go.
Thank you,
Glad to be here.
Thank you. It means a lot to me to have you here today. How about yourself, Rich?
So I probably, right now, I'm retired, so I probably fit more into 3, although not specifically. I taught Spanish for 18 years in the St. Vrain Valley School District at Niwot High School. Then I went off into private industry, and as a part of my job in private industry, did a lot, kind of shifted more from teaching students to working with teachers in professional development and other kinds of things. Then I kind of went more away from world languages, was just in sales in general. And so now I just retired at the beginning of February. And now I'm kind of interested in shifting back into the world languages realm, probably not going back into like a high school classroom again, but definitely interested in working with teachers when I have the opportunities. But I don't really know. I'm not driven by anything because I am retired. So, but if something like podcasting or blogging or face-to-face professional development came my way, I might be interested in doing that. But so I was very interested. I'm doing a lot of reading now that I didn't have time for previously because of my job, and just trying to attend things like this.
Okay. Great, thank you. Well, you're definitely the right person to be here. Funny story for you. I grew up and went to high school in Boulder, and I took a girl to the homecoming dance at Niwot High. Must have been back in like 1998.
Well, I was probably gone from Niwot. I think I left the summer of '96 was the year that I left after 18 years there, and then started my other career.
Cool. All right. Well, this is great. This is going to be a very interesting conversation because we've got kind of a variety of people, variety of backgrounds here. Definitely going to be interested in your thoughts on this, Rich, as somebody that has taught in more of a traditional academic high school program. All right. So I'd just like to start with the end in mind, typically, right? So what are my top 10 tips for becoming a conversational teacher? Maybe Lance and Rich, you guys could just go back and forth and read these off to me.
Sure. Number 1 is learn a second language yourself.
Good. I think you're on mute, Rich.
Sorry about that. I did that because I didn't know what kinds of noises were going to come from the neighborhood. Number 2, focus on your students.
Number 3, make sure your students understand you.
Number 4, relevant vocabulary should be the initial focus for students in their first 90 days.
Number 5, all activities should be done from the perspective of a conversation.
Number 6, get your students talking from the very first lesson.
Number 7, show your students how to study and practice in between classes.
Number 8, easy on the grammar.
Number 9, stop talking.
Number 10, find your students' native speakers?
Good. So again, these are my top 10 tips as somebody that has been kind of teaching what I call conversationally for the past 20 years or so. I've got a lot more to dive into here, but before we really go into detail, to make sure that we hit the most important information, as you read through those, are there any points here that you want to make sure we really talk about in full detail? Do you have any questions or comments, or perhaps anything that you've seen here that you don't necessarily agree with?
I'm curious about number 3, I guess. If you could just clarify, make sure your students understand you.
Yes.
You're saying literally understand the English that you're speaking to them? Is that what you mean by understanding you?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in more detail. So that's coming up. But now that I know that that's super important to you, we'll make sure that we spend some good time on that one.
Right. Okay, I guess.
How about you?
I'm good. I'm good with these. Yeah.
You're good with these? Okay,
Mhm.
Cool. All right, now, the first one here, I am going to assume this is not very important for either of you, right? Rich, you're obviously speaking English with us and you taught Spanish, so you're bilingual, yeah? Do you speak any other languages by chance?
I shouldn't say that I speak French. I studied French, and then I traveled in France at the end of my year in Spain, which was in my college years, so way back in the 70s, and was pretty proficient at that time, just haven't done anything with it. So I could regain my French if I had the opportunity.
Okay, great. And Lance, I know you're a true polyglot. What languages do you speak?
Sure. So my first was Spanish, and then I picked up Brazilian Portuguese, continued in university to study the European version of Portuguese as well. And then I did Japanese, I have a degree in Russian, and I speak Italian.
Amazing. I was on that track until I really got fascinated with Spanish. So I spent all my time and effort on Spanish. I've always had a fantasy with French. That was the first language I always wanted to learn. And I still hoped one day to be able to actually accomplish it. But I just felt like there's been so much to do with just Spanish and English right here locally. So this first step is to learn a second language yourself, right? This message is really a little bit more from my experience working in the ESL world here in the United States. I actually used to be the president of CoTESOL. I was on their executive track. I got nominated to be on CoTESOL and kind of worked my way up through to be the president. And so that's a very academic organization, helping people, improve their teaching, teaching English, right? But it seems like, a lot of, especially ESL teachers, tend to forget the fact that they're teaching somebody a second language, right? It's not that they're just teaching English, they're teaching a second language. And as somebody that really struggled with learning how to speak Spanish, like it was not easy for me, I just don't think it's possible or you can be the most effective teacher unless you go through that process yourself, unless you know what it's like to learn a new language. And I'm not talking about like the people that just happen to be born into a bilingual household that grow up speaking Spanish and English, because when you're acquiring that both those languages as a kid, very different experience than trying to acquire the language as an adolescent or an adult, right? So the focus, is on learning the new language. And a key word here is empathy, right? I don't think if you're a monolingual ESL teacher, and I experienced this too because I lived in Spain when I was trying to learn Spanish. My teacher did not speak English, she was monolingual. She was a monolingual Spanish teacher, right? And I just don't think it's possible to develop that empathy for what somebody's going through with their second language unless you've actually gone through that experience yourself, and I've seen teachers that get frustrated with their students, like, why aren't you learning this? Why, it's a second language, it's hard. And then I love this image, right? I just looked up images for people playing charades. So especially true with brand new students that really don't speak the language at all. If you're not bilingual and if you can't use the student's native language to kind of explain things to them, then you end up playing these very elaborate games of charades. So let's imagine this was an ESL class. What do you think this teacher is trying to explain to the students here?
I mean, just at first glance, I guess she's trying to get them to say something like ballerina, ballet dance or something like
Dance, yeah.
So that's interesting that you would say ballet, right? That thought certainly occurred to me, but another one that occurred to me is yoga. Right? She could be teaching the word ballet or dance or yoga or another one that almost looks like she could be going into the beginning of that. If you ever heard that song, I'm a little teapot, short and stout, right? Like she could be trying to explain a teapot. I mean, the point is, me being bilingual in Spanish, I can very easily explain to my Spanish-speaking ESL students in those initial days what something means, right? And if you're not, you just get into these very drawn out games of charades that may or may not actually deliver the meaning, as we just saw with this image, right? It could be ballet, it could be yoga, it could be a teapot. There could be multiple things that she's trying to say. And so students might start making assumptions, and that's not good when your students are assuming what you're talking about. Any questions about this or any comments? Because I know we've got Lance, who's going to be teaching soon, and then Rich, who's got a very long career of teaching behind him. Questions or comments about becoming bilingual before you start teaching a new language?
I guess the only thing that occurs to me, I think I'm understanding more and more, David, as we work together. I guess my question is, how much should I be willing to speak Spanish, with the students? I think you've indicated that pretty much the first 2 levels, maybe the first 3 levels, you're willing to speak Spanish and then stop. Yeah,
and I'll be spending some time on that in a couple of slides here.
Okay.
But yeah, I believe in what I call a phased immersion approach, which is kind of like, if you look at the first 3 months, because I'm mostly fascinated with the first 3 months of language acquisition, where in the first month I might explain 75% of the class in what we call L1, the student's first language or native language, right? And then in the second month, I go down to 50%. And in the third month, I go down to 25%. And by the time that students are entering into their 4th month, they've learned enough of the new language that they can understand everything that I'm trying to teach them. And I no longer have to use their native language, right? So then I go into, pure immersion after a few months. And, I do that based on my own experiences. Like almost everybody here in the United States, I took high school Spanish and I didn't learn anything except for maybe ¿Dónde está el baño? ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? Right? That's what I remember from my high school Spanish days, and more so trying to get the teacher off track and learn the bad words and the cuss words and stuff like that, right? So when that didn't really work for me, I decided when I was 18, I've got to move to a Spanish-speaking country. So I got on a plane and I moved to Spain, and I got into immersion programs. And that's where I had a teacher that did not speak a word of English. And I really did not speak a word of Spanish, right? I did that for a month, and it was one of the most miserable months of my life. Everybody talks about how immersion is the best experience they've ever gone through. And I've got to tell you, having 0 Spanish skills, it was a miserable experience. And then I remember coming back, not having been defeated, still trying to learn how to speak Spanish, I enrolled in night classes at CU Boulder. And my teacher was speaking English to me, explaining Spanish to me. And I remember having all these aha moments like, oh, that's what that teacher was talking about. Now I get it because somebody explained it to me in a way that was understandable, right? And so later, after I got to kind of what I would consider an intermediate level of Spanish, I studied for about 2 years academically at the college level. And then I did another immersion trip. And I entered into the school's intermediate level of Spanish. I was conversational at that point. I was able to understand almost everything. I was able to express myself. And then my confidence just, skyrocketed because I went through so I think pure immersion is very useful at a certain point, but it can also be very, stressful if the student's not quite ready for it. So that's why I like my phased immersion approach. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So my second step is my second tip on being the best conversational teacher you can be is to always focus on your students. And sometimes this is a hard thing for teachers to do, right? Because we've studied, we went through a program for typical, I was a college Spanish major, so I had 4 years of that academic approach to learning Spanish. And we're kind of used to that experience. And then if we've gone on to grad school, we spend extensive time studying theory and all this other stuff. But I've got to tell you, what your students want is to learn how to speak the language, right? They really do. What I've found to be extremely helpful to get to know my students so that I can best serve my students is to really focus in on them and create a student profile where I'm looking at their nationality, I'm looking at what their first language is, I'm looking at what their educational background is. I have to take into consideration their age, their experience with the new language, their reasons for learning, and their current level when I start working with them. Who knows what the effective filter is? All right, so Rich, you know the effective filter. Can you chime in and tell us about the effective filter?
Yeah, so I know for us in Colorado as teachers, this probably really came to prominence maybe early 90s or something when we were wanting to be more conversational in our classes. Now, again, so Lance, I think you understand. So as David said, I taught in a more traditional, but I don't want to use that in a negative term. I taught in a case where kids were coming into a class as part of their regular high school schedule, and it was an elective and that type of thing. But I don't want to think that what I was doing was a traditional language experience. But anyway, so what I understood the affective filter to be was I wanted my students to be in a conversational setting. What could I do to make that be the most comfortable setting, to make that be a setting where there wasn't a lot of nervousness on their part about using the language, about understanding the language. And so we always talked about what is there in your teaching techniques that drops that filter that makes them be more comfortable. Now, for us adults, it's often a glass of wine or a beer or something that helps to do that. But obviously with high school students, you can't do that. Or maybe in your classes, that wouldn't be something that you would approve. But it really does go so much more than that. It really is, what are you doing in your experiences with your students to, and I know David has this in a couple of places here, probably, especially number 3, reduce their anxiety. For me, working with adolescents, that was probably the biggest thing, because many of them did have anxiety because they were so peer conscious. How could I make them feel comfortable?
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us, Rich. Yeah. Anxiety is a huge one. So I've recently read this paper from Stephen Krashen, called Down with Forced Speech. And he gives this story about talking to his neighbor that is going to a community college Spanish class. And the neighbor says, it says here, she told me, I just took a Valium. I had to. It's Spanish class. It freaks me out. So
Sad.
I don't know what exactly was going on in that class, right? But anxiety is a huge thing. And, I think for me, and this is what I've been told, I've been working with a mentor for a couple of months now. I don't know, do you know Bryce Hedstrom, Rich? So I've been working with Bryce, and he's been observing my classes and stuff. And he's been telling me that one of my, I don't know, the highlights of my teaching skills is my ability to kind of reduce this affective filter, right? And that kind of gets back to my first step, because I went through that experience. It was such a difficult experience, especially living in Spain when I didn't speak any Spanish. I'm so empathetic to that anxiety that is there, because I can relate with it, right? So I think, as we see in a lot of these second language acquisition theories, that say you can't actually teach somebody to be a teacher, to speak a new language. You can't, that actually can't be taught. Language acquisition can't be taught. It just comes naturally over time, right? So now I never knew what the affective filter was until about a year ago. But something that I've always done with my classes was to really focus in on their motivation to learn why they're learning the language, and then cater my classes to that, to build that motivation factor up. And I'm really big on building self-confidence, right? And then, of course, reducing anxiety, trying to create. And I think one of the biggest things we can do as world languages teachers is to create these situations for our students where we're less concerned with actually teaching them how to speak the new language, and more concerned with creating really comfortable situations for them to go through that practice, right? And if you don't really have a good idea of who your students are, it's going to be very hard for you to do that, right? So Lance, you were asking me about, using the student's native language to teach their second language, right? Their new language, right? And this is less of a science, and I think it's more of an art of when and how to do that, right? Ultimately, each teacher is going to be a little bit different and do things a little bit differently. But as in your age is going to be really important to this. The older you are, you might need more L1 in the classroom. The younger you are, little kids, if we can really get, preschool students jumping into this stuff, they're more likely to be successful in a pure immersion environment, right? But I think once we've hit kind of the adolescent age, our teen years and our adult years especially, we've got a first language system established. And I've heard all of these teachers say, to justify their reasons for pure immersion from the beginning is that they want to get their students to start thinking in the new language as soon as possible. And if we were living in a vacuum, like if you're in a true immersion experience where you're learning Spanish and you're living in a Spanish country, there may be more substance to that approach, right? But I think naturally, once we've got that first language system established, there's not a person that isn't translating it in their head, So to try and encourage that, like I respect the fact that the theory is pure immersion from the beginning is much more likely to get the person to think in the new language. However, let's go back to that anxiety thing, right? It increases, it can cause so much anxiety in the student and demotivate them so much that they give up. So it's something you have to be sensitive to. Now, I'm not saying this is the absolute right way to do it. In my experience of working with adults, I've found that it's very helpful that I speak Spanish to my native Spanish speakers learning English, and I speak English to my American students learning Spanish in the first 90 to 180 days, right? My first 3 to 6 months. Now, that's not to say that if I have an advanced student that's struggling with the meaning of a certain word, that I won't just use their first language to say, oh, that's just this word, right? Or if I get to kind of an advanced, especially when it comes to like grammar, if you look down here in the bottom right, using the student's first language really makes teaching vocabulary easy and explaining grammar, especially when you get into disconnections, because we know, for example, Spanish and English have certain things that don't exist. In English, we use auxiliary verbs, So when I'm teaching what an auxiliary verb is and how to use do or does, I explain that in Spanish, right? I can't imagine somebody trying to learn that in pure English and not knowing what the grammatical concept is to it in the first place, right? So it can make that easier. And another thing, right? If we're big on comprehensible input, which I think everybody is, using somebody's native language instantly makes everything comprehensible, right? Everybody has a different take on that. Rich, I know you've been greatly exposed to comprehensible input. What's your take on that?
So my procedure in working with students, and again, I taught multiple levels. So what I did with a level 1 student might be slightly different than what I would do with a level 2 or 3 student. But I would be conducting as much of the class in Spanish as I could. I think there are methods that can be very effective even with incomprehensible input. So when you're using comprehensible input, back to your example of that girl, whether she was a teapot or a ballerina or whatever she was, if you can simply use a visual or action and convey it immediately, wonderful, don't use English. Sometimes that doesn't, sometimes it can be misinterpreted. In a classroom setting, if you're truly in a classroom, going to the board, a whiteboard, chalkboard, whatever you happen to have, and quickly writing, a word in the target language equals this in English, and sometimes leaving that, because again, if that's a word that's going to reappear, for a student to glance back up and go, oh yeah, that's what that is. That allows you then to sometimes stay in the target language longer, because and I think you are reducing that anxiety because you've made a useful tool up there. So I'm totally in agreement with you. I think in my high school students, I would never have said I'm going to stay solely in English for 90 to 100 days. Level 1 probably had more English in there. Another thing that I used to do was exactly what you said, David. I just had this little thing with my level 2 and 3 when I probably was 75 to 95% of the time in Spanish. But there would be times where I would just stop and I'd ask them in Spanish, hey, will you let me speak English for a minute? But I asked my class that. And it took them a while for the joker in the class who would go, no. And I'd go, okay, no problem. And then everybody else is throwing, things at him because they wanted me to explain it. But in those moments, and sometimes I even physically changed my body. I would move over to like this imaginary box here where within 2 minutes I could explain that grammatical concept, then get back into place and continue in Spanish. But I do agree with what you said, David. If I had not done that, I could have tried forever to stay in Spanish and communicate something, and just created a level of stress for a lot of students. So sorry, I probably went on longer than you wanted on that, but ways that I did things that totally are in line with what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I love hearing the practice from teachers that are actually doing this, because this, like I said at the beginning of the slide, this is more of an art than a science, right? When I say I use English to teach Spanish in the first 90 to 100 days, I'm not saying that I teach the class 100% in English, right? Like I was talking earlier about my phased approach to immersion, where in my first month, I might, speak Spanish 25% of the time. And I should qualify that a little bit better. When I'm explaining things, when I'm teaching, right? I'm teaching in English so that they understand what I'm talking about. But then when the students are practicing or talking to each other in the class, they're speaking in the target language, right? And I just gradually phase that out, right? So like, depending on the anxiety levels, the comfort levels, and the levels of motivation, because different students are different, right? Lance and I were talking about one of my students yesterday, Monica, that has an extremely high level of anxiety. And at the same time, we've got another student in the class that has, an extremely high level of self-confidence. And so like balancing, it's an art form to try and balance those expectations, where I think our focus as teachers has to be whatever works that reduces anxiety and motivates your students, right? And at the same time, I recognize what I wrote up here in the red here. There's a huge caveat with this, is that it can be a crutch, right? It can become a crutch. I've had students get used to that, where at some point they have to take that leap into the new language and accept the fact that they're learning a new language, and they have to start trying to listen to it and understand it and speak it more, right? So that's why I have this kind of guideline, and where I think it's acceptable in the first 90 to 180 days, depending on the student's, comfort level. But also recognizing that at some point, when I get into intermediate classes and in advanced classes, if I'm still having to explain things in the student's native language, something bad has happened, right? There's now, so it's a delicate balance. All right, so continuing along with this thought, and I spend a lot of time on focusing on the student, right? Just because I think it's so important. You want to have a really good understanding of why your students are learning that language, so that you can make the classes relevant for the students. And I really think it's if you can develop some sort of a specialty. Now, this is probably more important for the teacherpreneur that's trying to make money independently, right? Where they can develop a specialty around teaching business English or travel Spanish or healthcare French, where they're exclusively focusing on doctors and nurses, right? I would imagine this is harder in the high school environment, right, Rich, where you're working, you're working with a variety of students from a variety of backgrounds. Now, did you say that your students were taking Spanish as an elective versus a requirement?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's good. So if they're taking it as an elective, then they're probably much more motivated, right?
I mean, well, I say that, I mean, many of them who are college bound are feeling the pressure that they should have 2 or more years, because some colleges will be looking at things like that. So, but it's not like they wouldn't graduate if they didn't have those years of language.
Gotcha. So, you could think about this in terms then of developing a specialty around high school Spanish, right? Because the conversations that I'm having with my adult students that are trying to learn how to speak Spanish so that they can use it at work are going to be much different than the conversations you're teaching your students of how to talk to their peers. And, what do high school kids like to you can still make it relevant for them, right?
And there's a lot of, so going back to your experience when you were in high school and my experience as a high school teacher, when sometimes we went in because of our curriculum or because of just what we had developed or whatever, and we had our predefined vocabulary list. There's a lot more thinking now of having, even though you may still have that and you kind of have a curriculum, like we're going to do these topics and so forth, within those topics, is there a way then that you can open it up for students to be interested in, yeah, but I want to talk about such and such. Great. Well, then let's develop a vocabulary list related to that. So you're not totally going off into healthcare, but what if it's the student who's more athletic or more music oriented or whatever? Let within some of those general topics, let them help to develop those words so that when you do ask them to talk about themselves, they have the words there. That's going to really add to their buy-in. So that's what I would say is probably more when you're in that kind of defined curriculum of a public school setting. You can still do that, not nearly as what you would do. And I did teach adult education Spanish for a while. And so I know what it was like to have the person who worked and wanted to know all the parts of the engine because she worked in a car parts store. And I'm, whoa. So I totally understand where you're going.
Cool, cool. So one thing that I do frequently with my classes, because I have a set curriculum, but every third or fourth class or so, I try and have a section on also developing relevant vocabulary where I turn it over to my students, right? So that could be, I think, a good resource to have is in a high school class, right? If you know you've got, students that are athletically inclined, find material, and this is where I think reading is really useful, right? Is if you can find them some reading materials that are at their level that talk about athletics or music or whatever that student's particular interest is, so that they can start kind of building, while they're still adhering to the set curriculum, you also give them the tools for personalizing that curriculum. Because it's, even in my situation, most of my students are trying to learn Spanish or English for work, for travel, and for living in kind of a mixed community, like Denver's kind of a bilingual community, right? But it's still pretty broad and generalized, right? So I try to make things relevant. I gave a class about 3 weeks ago. I was teaching English, and I was teaching my students how to kind of go deeper into conversation, how to start conversations with people where you're essentially asking people, hey, what do you like, right? What do you like? What are your interests? What makes you laugh? That sort of thing. And we came across a topic that one of my students was really interested in. He loves tennis. And so now I'm coaching Claudia, who's my other student, to kind of dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so Rafa says that he likes tennis. What are some questions you can ask him about tennis, right? And she asked him the first question. So where do you play? Oh, I play at this court over here. Okay. Who's your favorite player? And when she said that, you can see this noticeable change come into Rafa's face where his eyes light up. He gets a big smile on his face. And I'm like, there we go. That's the magic that's happening. We're going to stay on this. And now that we've found something that he's really interested in, let's dive in deep and let those two start, I step out of the conversation at that point and I just let them keep going, and it's fantastic when you make it relevant, right? And when you see a student's eyes light up. So I try to build that in frequently. Cool. So let's see here. We're getting some good conversations going. So this has taken a while. We'll probably have to split this up into at least one more section. Because
I did want to explain, and I apologize. I have a grandson to pick up from school in 15 minutes. Well, I have to leave in 15 minutes to pick him up. So I will only be on until the top of the hour.
Yeah, that's when we're going to wrap up too. So we'll schedule a follow-up as well. All right. So my third tip is to make sure that your students understand you. I don't know why this thought or this point seems to get lost on teachers, especially that are really in favor of that pure immersion from the beginning. I don't think we have that issue with Lance or with Rich. I think you guys kind of get this from what we were talking about, right? But some of the points I want to make here is if you don't understand something, you're just not going to learn it, period. Right? If there's no understanding, there's no possible way for development. And I frequently give the example to justify why I use a student's first language to teach, is to imagine if you wanted to learn something really technical like mechanics, right? If you wanted to learn how to fix cars and you went to, let's say, a Chinese mechanic that doesn't speak English and was explaining everything in Mandarin to you, and you don't understand Mandarin, right? How confident would you feel in putting together a motor? What do you think, Lance?
Yeah. There's zero confidence there. I can assure you.
I mean, you can kind of, you're making these assumptions because we get a lot of nonverbal communication and gestures and stuff like that. But imagine if we put the bolt in the wrong place and don't secure it the right way, that person's driving the car away and it's going to blow up on them, right? And I think increasingly most of the true second language acquisition experts, the linguists in this field of language acquisition, definitely agree that most of the language acquisition comes from comprehensible input, right?
Sorry,
everything else is just noise. Go ahead, Lance.
Dave, you kind of faded out there at the end. I didn't hear most of it comes through.
Okay, so I think, most of the experts that are in this field today tend to agree on one point, which is most language acquisition comes through what's called comprehensible input.
Comprehensible input. Okay.
Yeah. So that essentially, in a conversation, you've got input and output, right? Input is what you're listening to, output is what you're saying, right? And comprehensible input is people talking to you at your current level and then maybe mixing in a little bit of stuff that's just one little level above your current level, right? So the theory is that most people would be able to understand that, and that's what comprehensible input is. And then everything else is just noise. And I got to tell you, this is what I felt like for a month when I lived in Spain. An entire month of blah, blah, blah. David, entiendes? Blah, blah, blah. And me saying, no entiendo, right?
Right.
Let's see here. Rich, I know you're familiar with Krashen. Can you read what he wrote about optimal input being comprehensible?
This is clearly the most important input characteristic. It amounts to the claim that when the acquirer does not understand the message, there will be no acquisition. In other words, incomprehensible input or noise will not help.
Right. So that's from page 63 of Krashen's book on principles and practice in second language acquisition. I highly recommend reading that book if you're in this field. All right, moving on along. Any questions about comprehensible input? I know this was one of your big ones, Lance, was trying to understand how long you use a student's native language in a class. How do you make things understandable?
Yeah, exactly. I've got such a varied experience with my, foreign language acquisition that it does occur to me that I really have to reach some kind of a balance, I guess, a degree of comfort with what I'm doing, using English, using Spanish when I'm actually teaching English. The immersion thing, I've experienced the immersion thing. I think I related, David, at least briefly, my experience arriving in Japan. We were immersed to an extent when we were in our language training. We had 60 days of Japanese, and we were told, okay, you can speak English, in the morning, like when you get up, you're showering, shaving, that sort of thing, talking to your roommates, that kind of stuff. But then when you get to class, there is no more English. You don't get to speak English for the rest of the day until once again you get ready to go to bed at night. It's all Japanese. So I understand the immersion thing, and it really can be frustrating. I totally understand.
Cool. Okay, good.
The thing I would add about that, and again, believe me, I'm not a proponent on 100% immersion type thing, but I think what I would add to that, Lance, is immersion and comprehensible input are not exclusive to each other. Really good immersion has to incorporate comprehensible input. It's when, like in David's example of being in Spain, if a teacher's going on and they're not working to make that language comprehensible, yeah, it's input, but what meaning does it have? So immersion done right, and immersion, in my opinion, especially with beginning students, that adds in those times, what I used to call my little safety nets of when the English would help them and so forth. That is what allows for the affective filter to drop, for the input to be comprehensible. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I like that thought. I was thinking earlier about, I think somebody mentioned having a student that worked at an auto parts store. Was that you, Rich? Right? And so that, I am somebody that I would say I have mastered the Spanish language. I've been teaching it now since 2005. I started studying it in 2001. I speak it on a daily basis. I perhaps speak more Spanish than I do English, but I could find myself in a situation where I have no idea what people are talking about in Spanish. If I had to, if I had a student that wanted me to teach them how to rebuild a motor in Spanish, I would have to pass on that opportunity, right? It's not my area of expertise. So cool. All right. Number 4, relevant vocabulary should be the primary focus, at least for a student's, initial starting period of learning how to speak a new language. So I watched this webinar by this gentleman, Chris Lunsdale. It was actually a TED Talk. Somebody forwarded it to me back in like 2014, I want to say. They sent me an email and they were being critical. They were kind of making fun of it, right? They were saying, David, get a load of this guy that says you can learn how to speak a new language in just 6 months, because I think most language instructors, if they've gone through that period, they probably were like me, where it took multiple years of study to learn how to speak a new language, right? And so when we hear these claims of learn a language in just 10 minutes of a day, or learn how to master a language in 6 months, or, these super fast ways to learn a language, it's very easy to dismiss that. Out of curiosity, Lance and Rich, I believe Spanish is your second language, each of you. Like it took me at least 2 years of study before I felt even remotely confident speaking Spanish. Maybe even longer. Maybe it took me more like 3 years where I started building up confidence. What was your experience with learning your second language?
Well, I was in 5th grade in Southern California. So age 11, the school decided that it was going to offer us what they at that time called an elective. They said, we're going to let you kids out on Friday afternoons for like, I was like 3 hours, I guess, in Friday afternoons to take a cooking class. They offered cooking. They offered like a ceramics, pottery class. I don't remember what else. Those are the 2 that I remember, besides a Spanish class. So I don't care. I care less about pottery. My mother teaches me how to cook. I don't need to worry about that. Spanish, that sounds like it might be kind of fun, And so I took that class, and maybe it was kind of an age-related thing. Since I was starting at age 11, maybe I acquired it more easily than a 50-year-old adult or something would do. But I just took to it like a fish to water. I just fell in love with it. Spanish will always have the special place in my heart because it was my first, second language. And I took it all through. Well, Arizona, we moved to Arizona. Arizona would not allow you to study a foreign language until you got to the 8th grade. So I had to skip 6th and 7th grades without being able to study my beloved Spanish. And I just could hardly wait to get to 8th grade. I took 5 years all the way from grade 8 through graduation from high school. And, I have a different experience from you, David. And I guess it's because, linguists talk about, whether certain people have knacks, for foreign language acquisition. Do I have a knack? I don't know. I read a lot of articles, books on that sort of thing, and the argument goes back and forth. No, linguists, polyglots don't have a knack. No, they just do this and this and this and this. No, I disagree. Most polyglots do have a knack. That's the argument. But I had a different experience in that I picked up Spanish easily. It was easy for me. And that's whenever I listen to you discuss how difficult your experience was, my heart just kind of bleeds a little bit. Oh, wow, I wish that I had been there to be able to help you maybe somehow or something, make it much easier.
Well, their age is a huge, huge factor into the language acquisition process, right? Typically speaking, the younger you are, the easier it is going, because you're still learning your first language and you're still kind of in this intuitive language learning state where it's easier for you to kind of put things together. And then it's all about the program too, typically speaking, from the programs I've seen that teach kids how to speak a new language when they're focused on kids, it is fun. They are doing songs and dance and, playing and doing all this other stuff, right? And it's a lot easier. Whereas once we get to the adult stage and we're so dependent on our first language, it becomes a lot more complicated. What about your experience, Rich? Is Spanish your second language?
It is. And so when I started in the school district I was in, you could start language as an elective in 7th grade. It was every day for, typical 45 minutes, that type thing. So by the time I was in high school, I was a sophomore, I think in level 3, probably something like that. But it was in that more traditional setting. It wasn't the way I ended up teaching my classes once I really started becoming more aware of a more communicative way. So interestingly, I was with a group of students who loved Spanish. We loved the study of it. I think I'm very verbal linguistic, so I just enjoyed that. But it wasn't that I was using the language. I wasn't able to really speak the language. I just loved studying about a language. And then a group of us kind of said, this is ridiculous. Why have we been doing this for so many years and we can't even just sit here and kind of have a conversation? So we kind of challenged ourselves, and it was painful. It was painful to do that. But finally we got to the point. So by the time I graduated from high school, we didn't offer AP at that time, but I definitely was in that realm of somebody that was, really approaching kind of an intermediate level, maybe intermediate advanced. And so then when I went on to the University of Colorado, just jumped right in. And so anyway, but it required that shift. So I think the traditional way of teaching language was more like probably your experience that you said you had in Boulder, and that you would just sit in a class forever and learn about a language and not use the language. So
right,
a lot of the methods there.
Cool. Well, the point on this slide is that this, I listened to this TED Talk with an open mind, because I had always felt internally that it shouldn't be so hard to learn a language. It's just the particular way that I went about it made it really hard. What this guy says in this TED Talk is that 80% of daily conversation comes from the same combination of someone's most commonly used 1,000 words. So if you think about that, and the reason why I say, typically try to say that I can get my students speaking a new language in 3 to 6 months is that's only 10 new words a day for 90 days, right? Now, the words, of course, depend on the learner. The high school language learner is using a different set of vocabulary than Mateo, my adult Spanish learner that's learning Spanish because he's a plant manager in, here in Aurora, right? So identifying those words is the challenge, right? But if you can, theoretically teach your students 1,000 words in the first 3 months, they're going to be able to use the language, right? And I like using flashcards with memorization. I think you can, my steps that I teach my students, and I actively teach my students how to use flashcards so that they can study, because a lot of students, when you say go study, they don't know what exactly you mean by that. I've yet to learn to meet a true language, someone that has not used flashcards and been successful with the language. My methodology is to first work on understanding. So I go from Spanish to English, and then I work on production, where I go from English to Spanish, right? And then just real quick, comprehensible reading, which is kind of counterintuitive. How is reading helping me speak the language better? It just helps with that comprehension thing. And I think regardless of your level, reading is going to help you build your vocabulary. So a combination of using flashcards and then using literature that's in line with the student's level and relevant to the student's interests and goals is great for learning vocabulary. And this is a great book by Bryce Hedstrom, High Impact Reading Strategies, that would be good for all language teachers. And I know you got to go, Rich, so I'm just going to hit this last one real quick. The letter R, I think, is really important when it comes to teaching those first, 1,000 words. They've got to be relevant words. You've got to be repetitive. Use them over and over and over again. They've got to be real words that students are really using on a daily basis. I always go back to that. ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? I've got that ingrained in my head from high school Spanish, and I've never once asked anybody in Spanish where the library was, right?
Exactly.
And it's odd.
But the irony of that, David, is take la biblioteca out of that, and donde está is probably one of the things that you use all the time. So that teaches you. So a lot of what I've done, so we have 5 grandchildren, and so I haven't tried to teach them Spanish. I've just watched them learn English, and I just see how a couple of words together, like donde está or do you want or something like that, is something that you use over and over and over again. So those phrases are real. And then as they grow in their interests and so forth, you just keep adding the new words to them.
Yep. Good. My point with the relevance is, a part of that phrase is highly important. I think it could have been a lot more motivational, right?
Right.
if they were using the example of where's the basketball court,
Yeah.
right? Where's the gym? Like, what do high school students do for fun? Where is your
example before of the students, and well, you said where do you, but where's the tennis court or what? In other words, the thing that Rafa already expressed interest. If now I can take those short memorized phrases and connect that to his interests or to her interests or whatever.
Exactly. Good. And the last R is reading, right? Reading's your best friend, regardless of your level. If you're in your first 90 days or if in your first 900 days, I don't think there's any better activity for building your vocabulary. And my theory is the more words you know, the more words you understand, the more you can understand when people are talking to you. The more words you can say, the more you're going to be able to converse. And it's odd, but reading is probably the best thing I can think of to develop that. Listening to the radio, okay, but you're going to get a lot of noise, and sometimes it's really hard to distinguish where one word starts and another one stops, But when you're reading, you can isolate those words, and you can look them up in a dictionary, and you can build your vocabulary. And that's going to get you speaking the language a lot faster. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I know some of us have to go. Does this same time work for next week to do a part 2?
I believe it's just fine for me, yes.
I think so.
All right, I'll schedule that for the same time next Friday. Before we go, questions or comments about anything we've discussed today?
Excellent conversation, excellent presentation.
Yeah, thanks for the interaction. Appreciate it.
All right, cool. I'll see you guys next week, hopefully.
Bye.
All right, bye.